The gunshot that shattered the silence of the Kansas plains sent a flock of startled birds into the cloudless sky as Faith Carter whipped the reins of her exhausted team, urging the horses to find strength they no longer possessed. The weathered canvas of her Conestoga wagon snapped in the wind as the vehicle bounced over the uneven terrain, each jolt sending spasms of fear through her body. Behind her, the thunder of hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by the occasional whoop of her pursuers, 5 armed men determined to run her down before she reached Leavenworth. "Come on," Faith shouted at her straining horses, her knuckles white against the leather reins. At 26, she had already endured more hardship than most women twice her age, but nothing had prepared her for this desperate flight across the open plains. The wagon, loaded with all her worldly possessions and the small fortune hidden beneath the floorboards, lurched dangerously as a wheel caught in a prairie dog hole. The year was 1876, and the West was still wild enough that a woman traveling alone might as well paint a target on her back. Faith had known the risks when she'd left St. Louis 3 weeks ago, but necessity had driven her west after her father's death left her with debts and unwanted suitors circling like vultures. Her cousin in Leavenworth had offered her a place to stay and perhaps a chance at a new beginning. Now, with armed men closing in, that new beginning seemed like a foolish dream. Another shot rang out, this one closer, kicking up dirt just yards from her wagon. Faith bit back a sob and glanced over her shoulder. The riders were gaining, their faces obscured by bandanas, their intentions clear in the pistols they brandished. "You can't outrun us, woman," one of them shouted. "Stop that wagon or we'll shoot your horses." Faith knew they wouldn't hesitate. The telegram she'd found in her father's papers after his death, the one that revealed the location of a gold claim he'd kept secret, would be worth killing for. These men must have been watching her since St. Louis, waiting for their chance. Ahead, the terrain changed, the flat prairie giving way to the foothills that bordered the approach to Leavenworth. Faith steered the wagon toward them, desperate for any advantage the rougher ground might provide. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she heard another rider gaining on her left flank. The first man was almost alongside her now, reaching for her reins. Faith lashed out with her whip, catching him across the face. He cursed and fell back momentarily, but she knew it was only delaying the inevitable. Her horses were spent, and the wagon was too heavy to outrun mounted men. As she approached the steep path that wound between 2 towering rock formations, Faith heard a different sound, a single rifle shot echoing from the heights above. The lead pursuer's horse reared suddenly, spooked by the bullet that struck the ground before it. The man struggled to control his mount as another shot rang out. Faith glanced up to see a lone figure on horseback on the ridge above a man silhouetted against the afternoon sky, rifle raised for another shot. He fired again, not at the men but at the rocky slope beside them. The bullet struck something that sparked, and Faith realized with shock that it must have been dynamite strategically placed among the rocks. The explosion was deafening. The mountainside seemed to shudder, and then rocks began to cascade down the slope. Faith's pursuers pulled up short, wheeling their horses in panic as the avalanche gathered momentum. Boulders and rubble thundered down, blocking the narrow pass completely, cutting off the armed men from their quarry. "Keep going," the stranger on the ridge shouted. "Follow the stream bed. I'll meet you on the other side." Faith didn't hesitate. She urged her exhausted team forward, following the course of a small creek that wound through the hills. Behind her, she could hear the frustrated shouts of her pursuers, now separated from her by tons of fallen rock. She followed the creek for nearly a mile before the terrain opened into a small hidden valley. There, waiting beside a stand of cottonwoods, was her rescuer. Up close, he was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the western sun. His eyes, startlingly blue beneath the brim of his worn hat, watched her approach with a mixture of concern and caution. "Looks like you've stirred up quite a hornet's nest, madam," he said as she pulled her wagon to a stop. "Name's Owen Patterson. Most folks just call me Pat." Faith caught her breath, studying the man who had saved her life. He sat tall in his saddle, a Winchester rifle resting across his lap, his expression serious but not unkind. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth as he waited for her response. "Faith Carter," she said finally. "And I'm much obliged for your help, Mr. Patterson. Those men have been following me for days." "Gold hunters?" he asked, his gaze shrewd. Faith hesitated. "How did you know? This is gold country." "And men don't usually chase a lone woman with that kind of determination unless there's something valuable at stake." He dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of a lifetime on horseback. "Your horses are done in. We should rest them before moving on." Faith felt a flicker of alarm. Just because this man had saved her didn't mean his intentions were pure. Owen Patterson seemed to read her thoughts. "Those men will find a way around that rockslide eventually. I know a place where you can lie low until we figure out what to do, unless you'd prefer to face them alone." Put that way, Faith knew she had little choice. She nodded slowly. "Lead on, Mr. Patterson. Just Pat, madam. Everyone calls me Pat." He mounted his horse again. "Follow me. It's not far and your team can manage it." As Faith followed the cowboy deeper into the hills, she couldn't help wondering if she had escaped one danger only to ride willingly into another. But something in Owen Patterson's straightforward gaze reassured her. For now, at least, she would trust the man who had created an avalanche to save a stranger. The place Owen Patterson led her to was a small cabin nestled in a grove of pine trees, nearly invisible until you were right upon it. A small corral stood empty beside it, and a creek gurgled nearby, providing water for both humans and animals. "It's not much," Pat said as he helped her unhitch her exhausted team, "but it's sturdy and hidden. Used to belong to an old prospector. He died last winter, and since he had no family that anyone knew of, I've been using it when I need a place to hole up." "You're not from Leavenworth?" Faith asked, rubbing down her horses while Pat carried water from the creek. "No, madam. I work for the Bar M Ranch south of here. Was heading back from delivering a herd when I spotted your trouble." He paused. "Those men will be looking for you. They'll expect you to head into town." Faith considered her options. Her cousin was expecting her, but Pat was right. Leavenworth would be the first place her pursuers would look. "How long do you think we should stay here?" "A day or two. Let your horses rest. Then I can guide you into town by a back trail." Faith nodded, but her wariness must have shown on her face. "You're welcome to keep your shotgun close at hand, Miss Carter," Pat said with a slight smile. "I understand a woman traveling alone can't be too careful. I'll sleep in the lean-to out back." His consideration surprised her. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson." "Pat," he corrected again, tipping his hat before leading his own horse to the corral. As evening fell, Faith helped Pat prepare a simple meal of beans, bacon, and coffee. They ate in a silence that gradually became comfortable rather than strained. Afterward, as they sat on the cabin's small porch watching the stars appear, Faith felt she owed her rescuer some explanation. "My father died 3 months ago," she began. "He was a banker in St. Louis, but he'd been out west in his younger days. After he passed, I found documents showing he had a gold claim near Leavenworth. A legitimate claim filed properly, but kept secret." Pat nodded, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. And somehow those men found out about it. There was a telegram among his papers, from someone named Blackwell who said the claim was producing as expected. I think one of my father's associates must have seen it and put together a gang to find the gold. They've been following me since St. Louis, probably thinking I'd lead them straight to it. You know where this claim is? Faith shook her head. Only that it's somewhere near Leavenworth. I was hoping my cousin might know more. She's married to a man who works for the land office. Pat exhaled a stream of smoke. Well, those men won't give up easily. Gold fever makes men do terrible things. He looked at her directly. You should know that there have been rumors of a rich strike somewhere in these hills for months. Nothing confirmed, but enough talk to bring prospectors sniffing around. My father was a careful man, Faith said. If he had a producing gold claim, he would have kept it quiet. Smart, Pat agreed. But it means you've got a target on your back until this is resolved. The following morning, Faith awoke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She found Pat outside, tending to the horses and scanning the hills with a practiced eye. No sign of your friends, he said when he noticed her. But that doesn't mean they're not looking. After a breakfast of bacon and biscuits, Pat surprised her by saying, I need to ride into Leavenworth today, get some supplies and maybe find out who these men are. Faith felt a flutter of alarm. You're leaving me here alone. It's safer than taking you into town where they might be watching. Keep the shotgun handy, but I don't think they'll find this place. He hesitated. Unless you'd rather make a run for Leavenworth now, Faith considered her options. Her horses needed more rest, and Pat was right about the danger of riding into town. No, I'll wait here, but you'll come back. Something in her voice made his expression soften. I give you my word, Miss Carter, I'll be back before sundown. After Pat rode out, Faith kept busy to distract herself from her worries. She cleaned the small cabin, inspected her wagon for damage from the chase, and checked on her horses. Every so often, she would stop and listen, fearing the sound of approaching riders, but the day remained quiet. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Faith's anxiety grew. Had Pat abandoned her? Or worse, had he run into the men who were hunting her? She was considering her options, whether to harness her team and try to find her way to Leavenworth alone, when she heard the welcome sound of hoofbeats approaching. Pat rode into the clearing leading a second horse loaded with supplies. His face was grim as he dismounted. What is it? Faith asked, recognizing trouble in his expression. Those men are in town, he said, unloading packages from the packhorse. 5 of them, asking questions about a woman traveling alone in a Conestoga wagon. They're saying you stole something valuable from them back east. Faith's hands clenched. That's a lie. They're after my father's claim. I figured as much. Pat carried the supplies into the cabin, motioning for her to follow. They're staying at the Drover's Hotel, drinking and watching the roads. I did some asking around about them. They're a bad lot. 3 of them were hired guns for the railroads during the range wars in Wyoming. Did they see you? Don't think so. I was careful. He unpacked food, ammunition, and to Faith's surprise, a dress and some other feminine necessities. Seeing her expression, he actually blushed slightly. Thought you might need some things. Had the shopkeeper's wife help me. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Faith. Thank you, but what do we do now? I can't hide here forever. No, but we need a plan. Pat sat at the rough table, gesturing for her to join him. Tell me more about this claim. You said your cousin's husband works at the land office. Yes, Frank Wilkins. My cousin Olivia wrote that he might be able to help me locate the claim once I arrived. Wilkins, Pat repeated. I know him. Honest man, from what I hear. He drummed his fingers on the table. Here's what I'm thinking. Tomorrow I'll ride back to town, find Wilkins, and bring him out here. If he can confirm the location of your claim, we can file the proper paperwork to ensure it stays in your name. Then we can figure out how to deal with those men. And if he can't, Pat's blue eyes met hers steadily, then we'll think of something else. I won't leave you to face this alone, Miss Carter. Faith studied him, this cowboy who had risked his life for a stranger and now continued to place himself in danger for her sake. Why are you helping me, Mr. Patterson? He looked away, seemingly embarrassed by the question. My ma raised me to help folks in trouble. Besides, he added with a slight smile, I've never much liked bullies or claim jumpers. That night, Faith slept better than she had in weeks, comforted by Pat's presence in the lean-to outside. She awoke to find him already up, checking his rifle and preparing to ride to town. I should be back by midday, he told her. Keep watch, just in case. After he left, the hours crawled by. Faith kept herself occupied by mending tears in her clothing and reorganizing her wagon. By noon, she found herself repeatedly glancing at the sun, measuring its progress across the sky. Midday came and went with no sign of Pat or her cousin's husband. By mid-afternoon, Faith's nerves were stretched tight. She paced the small clearing, shotgun in hand, starting at every sound from the surrounding forest. When she finally heard horses approaching, she retreated to the cabin, positioning herself by the window with her weapon ready. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Pat's tall figure, accompanied by a shorter man she assumed was Frank Wilkins. But her relief turned to alarm when she saw the grimness of both men's expressions. Miss Carter, Frank Wilkins said after introductions were made, I'm afraid I have troubling news. The men looking for you came to the land office this morning. They had papers forged, I believe claiming ownership of your father's gold claim. When I wouldn't recognize them, they threatened my family. Faith gasped. Is Olivia safe? For now. I sent her and the children to stay with her sister in Topeka. Wilkins ran a hand over his balding head. These men are dangerous, Miss Carter. They've hired 2 more gunmen in town. They're determined to get that gold. Do you know where the claim is? Pat asked. Wilkins nodded. I do. Your father registered it properly 5 years ago, though he used a business associate's name for the paperwork to keep it quiet. It's in Bear Creek Canyon, about 15 miles west of here. Faith's mind raced. Then it's legally mine as his heir. It is, if you can prove your identity and relationship to Gerald Carter. I brought the necessary forms. He produced papers from his coat. But those men aren't interested in legalities. They want the gold and they'll kill to get it. So will half the territory if word gets out about a rich strike, Pat added grimly. Faith looked between the 2 men. What should we do? Wilkins hesitated. The law in Leavenworth is compromised. Sheriff Holloway has been drinking heavily since his wife died, and his deputy is young and inexperienced. Which leaves us on our own, Pat concluded, an idea formed in Faith's mind. What if we went to the claim? If I could remove enough gold to start a new life elsewhere, I'd gladly let those men have the rest. Both men looked at her in surprise. It's not that simple, Wilkins said gently. Mining requires equipment knowledge, and those men would follow you. Not if they don't know we've gone, Pat said slowly, considering. Wilkins, if you filed those inheritance papers for Miss Carter without telling anyone, and then spread word that she'd continued on to Denver, Wilkins caught on, it might buy you time. Time enough to reach the claim and take what we can carry, Faith said, warming to the plan. Pat looked troubled. It's risky, very risky. Do you have a better idea? Faith challenged. After a moment, he shook his head. No, madam, I don't. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning. Wilkins would return to town, file Faith's inheritance papers quietly, and then start a rumor that she had been seen heading west toward Denver. Meanwhile, Pat would guide Faith to Bear Creek Canyon by a roundabout route to throw off any pursuers. As Wilkins prepared to leave, he handed Faith a small leather pouch. "Your father sent this to me for safekeeping last year. Said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you when you arrived." Inside the pouch was a small brass key and a folded paper with a rough map drawn on it. At the bottom, in her father's handwriting, were the words, "Faith, trust only those who have earned it. The true wealth is in the western shaft." Father, after Wilkins departed, Faith and Pat studied the map by lamplight. "Bear Creek Canyon," Pat mused. "I know it. Rough country, but passable if you know the way." He looked up at Faith. "We should leave at first light. Pack only what you need. We'll travel faster with just our horses and a pack horse for supplies." "Leave my wagon?" Faith asked, dismayed at the thought of abandoning all her possessions. "We can't take it where we're going. The terrain's too rough, and it would leave a trail a blind man could follow." Seeing her distress, he added gently, "We can hide it here. If all goes well, you can come back for it later." Faith knew he was right, but the wagon represented her last connection to her old life, to the father who had raised her alone after her mother died. Still, she nodded in agreement. "We leave at dawn." That night, as they made final preparations, Faith found herself watching Pat as he cleaned his rifle and checked their supplies. In the few days she had known him, this quiet cowboy had risked his life for her multiple times, asking nothing in return. In St. Louis, she had been pursued by wealthy suitors interested only in her father's banking connections. Owen Patterson seemed a different breed of man entirely. "May I ask you something, Mr. Patterson?" she said as they sat by the fire. "Pat," he corrected automatically. "What's on your mind?" "You're risking a great deal for a stranger. Most men would have ridden away after helping me escape those riders." He was silent for a moment, staring into the fire. "My father was a miner," he said finally. "Had a small claim in Colorado, nothing big but enough to support us. One day, 3 men rode in while he was working alone. They shot him, took his claim, and threatened to kill me and my mother if we reported it." His jaw tightened at the memory. "I was 14, too young to fight but old enough to understand what had happened. We left Colorado and my mother died 2 years later, broken by grief and hardship." "I'm so sorry," Faith said softly. Pat shrugged. "It was a long time ago, but I swore I'd never stand by and watch something like that happen to someone else." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Those men chasing you are cut from the same cloth as the ones who killed my father. Men who take what they want and don't care who gets hurt." In that moment, Faith understood him better. His help wasn't just chivalry or kindness, it was a form of justice, a way of fighting back against the type of men who had destroyed his family. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "And thank you for helping me." He nodded, a bit embarrassed by the conversation. "We should get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day." They set out before sunrise, Faith riding a horse borrowed from Wilkins, with her most essential possessions packed on a third horse. The wagon they concealed as best they could, covering it with branches in a thicket behind the cabin. Pat led them on a circuitous route, following game trails and dry creek beds where they would leave minimal tracks. By midday, they had covered nearly 10 miles, though in a roundabout fashion that Pat hoped would confuse any pursuers. "Bear Creek Canyon is beyond that ridge," Pat said during a brief rest, pointing to a distant line of hills. "But we'll circle around and approach from the north. Less chance of being spotted that way." Faith nodded, trying to ignore her aching muscles. She had ridden horses in St. Louis, but never for hours across rough terrain. Still, she was determined not to complain. As they continued their journey, the landscape grew more rugged, with pine forests giving way to rocky slopes and deep ravines. Pat rode with confidence, occasionally stopping to check their back trail or study the map Faith's father had provided. "Your father was smart," he commented. "This map shows landmarks only someone familiar with the area would recognize, not obvious trails. Even if those men got hold of it, they'd have trouble finding the claim." By late afternoon, they reached a narrow valley with a small creek running through it. Pat held up a hand, signaling Faith to stop. "Bear Creek," he said quietly. "The canyon narrows about a mile ahead. According to your map, the mine entrance should be near a formation that looks like a wolf's head." They proceeded cautiously, leading their horses through the growing shadows of the canyon. The walls rose steeply on either side, and Faith felt a growing sense of claustrophobia. "There," Pat said suddenly, pointing to an outcropping of rock high on the canyon wall. In the fading light, it did indeed resemble a wolf's head in profile. Below the formation, partially hidden by brush and fallen rocks, they found the entrance to a mine shaft, secured by a heavy wooden door with a rusted padlock. "Your father's key," Pat reminded her. With trembling hands, Faith produced the small brass key from the pouch Wilkins had given her. It turned in the lock with difficulty, but the mechanism finally gave way with a reluctant click. Pat lit a lantern he had brought and handed Faith a second one. "Stay close," he warned. "Old mines can be dangerous." The tunnel extended into the hillside, shored up with wooden supports that creaked ominously in places. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of earth and minerals. They followed the main shaft for perhaps 100 yards before it branched. "Your father mentioned a western shaft," Pat recalled. They took the left-hand tunnel, which sloped gently downward. After another 50 yards, they came to a small chamber where mining equipment lay scattered picks, shovels, and an ore cart on rusted rails. "This is it," Faith breathed, raising her lantern. The light caught and reflected on something embedded in the wall of the chamber. A vein of quartz shot through with bright yellow flecks. "Gold," Pat confirmed, examining the vein closely. "And a rich strike by the looks of it." He ran his fingers along the wall. "Your father worked this carefully, taking just enough to avoid drawing attention." Faith noticed a wooden chest in one corner of the chamber. Using her key again, she opened it to find canvas bags filled with gold dust and nuggets. "There must be thousands of dollars here," she whispered. Pat nodded grimly. "And now you understand why those men are so determined to find this place." They spent the next hour exploring the mine, discovering 2 more veins in adjacent chambers. By Pat's estimation, the claim was worth a small fortune, more than enough to secure Faith's future, and then some. "We should take what we can carry and seal the mine again," Pat suggested. "Make it look abandoned in case those men ever find it." Faith agreed, and they filled their saddlebags with gold from the wooden chest. As they worked, Faith noticed Pat was careful to take only a single small nugget for himself. "You should take more," she told him. "Without your help, I might never have reached this place." Pat shook his head. "I didn't help you for gold, Miss Carter." "Then why did you help me?" she asked, emboldened by their shared adventure. He seemed flustered by the direct question. "Let's just say I've grown fond of your company," he said finally. "Now we should rest while we can. I want to be moving at first light, in case those men manage to pick up our trail." They made camp just inside the mine entrance, not daring to light a fire that might be seen from a distance. As they shared a cold supper of jerky and hardtack, Faith found herself studying Pat in the dim lantern light. The shadows accentuated the strong lines of his face, the determination in his jaw, the kindness in his eyes. "What will you do?" he asked suddenly. "After this is over?" Faith had been pondering that very question. "I'm not sure. I could return to St. Louis, I suppose, though there's nothing left for me there. I might stay in Kansas or perhaps go further west. California's nice, Pat offered, or so I've heard. Have you traveled much? Some. Drove cattle to Montana, worked ranches in Texas and Colorado. He paused. Never stayed in one place too long. And now, he shrugged, been working for the Bar-M for almost 2 years. Longest I've stayed anywhere since I was a boy. He looked at her curiously. What about you? What were you looking for when you left St. Louis? Faith considered the question. Safety at first, a place where I could start over without my father's debts hanging over me. She smiled slightly. I never expected to find a gold mine or to be chased across Kansas by armed men. Life out west is full of surprises. Pat agreed with a small smile of his own. They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their lives. Faith told him about growing up in St. Louis, the daughter of a banker who had never quite fit into society after her mother's early death. Pat spoke of his years drifting from ranch to ranch, the skills he'd learned, the places he'd seen. There was an ease between them that Faith had never experienced with any of her suitors back east. As they finally prepared to sleep, Pat insisted on taking the first watch. I'll wake you in a few hours, he promised. Faith settled onto her bedroll, acutely aware of Pat sitting just a few feet away, rifle across his knees as he guarded their camp. Despite the danger that might still be pursuing them, she felt safer than she had in months. She was awakened before dawn by Pat's hand on her shoulder. Someone's coming, he whispered. At least 3 riders moving slow like they're tracking. Fear surged through Faith as she quickly gathered her things. How did they find us? Doesn't matter now. We need to move. Pat was already saddling the horses, working quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. They sealed the mine entrance, scattering debris to make it look abandoned, and then mounted their horses. Pat led them up a narrow game trail that climbed steeply away from the canyon floor. If we can reach the ridge before they spot us, we might lose them in the forest on the other side, he explained in a low voice. They had almost reached the top of the ridge when a shout echoed up from below. Looking back, Faith saw 3 riders entering the canyon, still some distance away but clearly following their trail. They've seen us, she said, her voice tight with fear. Keep moving, Pat urged. The trees will give us cover. They pushed their horses harder, cresting the ridge and plunging into the dense pine forest on the northern slope. Pat set a punishing pace, weaving between trees and across small streams in an effort to break their trail. After an hour of hard riding, they paused in a small clearing to rest their blowing horses. Faith could hear nothing but bird calls and the rustle of wind through the pines. Did we lose them? She asked hopefully. Pat shook his head. Not for long. Those men know what they're after. They'll keep coming. He studied the surrounding forest. We need a better plan than just running. Faith thought of the gold weighing down their saddlebags. We could split up. I could ride for Leavenworth while you lead them in another direction. No, Pat said firmly. I won't leave you alone out here. The crack of a rifle shot interrupted their discussion, the bullet splintering bark from a tree just feet from where they stood. Both ducked instinctively. Into the trees, Pat ordered, pulling Faith toward denser cover as another shot rang out. They scrambled deeper into the forest, leading their nervous horses. Pat helped Faith mount, then swung into his own saddle. Head northeast, he instructed. I'll be right behind you. Faith urged her horse forward, ducking low branches as they fled through the forest. Behind them, she could hear shouting and the sounds of pursuit. Pat rode close behind, occasionally turning in his saddle to fire his rifle, more to slow their pursuers than with any real hope of hitting them in the dense woods. The chase continued throughout the morning, with Faith and Pat staying just ahead of their hunters. Around midday, they emerged from the forest onto a rocky plateau. Ahead, the land fell away into a steep valley with mountains rising beyond. "We're running out of places to hide," Faith said, breathing hard as they paused to rest their exhausted horses. Pat surveyed the terrain with a practiced eye. "There's a trail down into that valley. It's rough going but passable. Once we're across, we can reach the stage road to Leavenworth." Before Faith could respond, rifle fire erupted from the trees behind them. One bullet kicked up stone splinters near Faith's feet, while another grazed Pat's upper arm, tearing his shirt and drawing blood. "Go," he shouted, pushing her toward the edge of the plateau. "Take that trail down." Faith hesitated, seeing the blood on his sleeve. "You're hurt. It's nothing. Go." He raised his rifle, returning fire to cover her retreat. Faith guided her horse to the narrow trail that zigzagged down the steep slope. The path was barely wide enough for a single horse, with a sheer drop on one side and the mountain wall on the other. She started down carefully, glancing back to see Pat still exchanging fire with their pursuers, who had taken cover among the trees at the edge of the plateau. When she was about a third of the way down, Pat finally mounted and followed, riding recklessly fast on the dangerous trail. Above them, 3 riders emerged from the forest and started down the path in pursuit. "They're still coming," Faith called, her voice tight with fear. Pat caught up to her, blood now staining his shirt sleeve crimson. "Keep going," he urged, "but be careful, this trail gets worse before it gets better." They continued their descent, the trail growing narrower and more treacherous. Loose stones rattled down the slope with each step their horses took. Behind them, their pursuers were gaining, taking chances on the dangerous path in their determination to catch their quarry. Suddenly, Pat pulled his horse to a stop beside a massive boulder that sat precariously balanced on the mountainside. "Faith, go on ahead," he said urgently. "Get to level ground." "What are you going to do?" she asked, afraid of the answer. He unslung his rifle. "I'm going to slow them down. Permanently if I can." Faith shook her head. "They'll kill you. Not if I can bring down that boulder first." He nodded toward the huge rock. "It's already unstable. One well-placed shot might send it down, taking the trail with it." Faith looked at the boulder, then at the narrow trail winding up the mountain where their pursuers were now visible, perhaps 200 yards above. "Go," Pat insisted. "I'll be right behind you." With a last worried glance, Faith continued down the trail. When she reached a wider section about 50 yards below, she stopped and looked back. Pat had dismounted and was studying the boulder, running his hands over its surface, looking for the perfect spot. The lead pursuer was now close enough that Faith could recognize him, a tall man with a bushy black beard who had been among those chasing her wagon. He spotted Pat and raised his rifle. "Look out!" Faith screamed. Pat ducked as a bullet whined off the rock face beside him. He returned fire, not at the man but at the base of the boulder where it rested against the mountain. The shot echoed through the valley, followed by an ominous rumble. The boulder shifted slightly, dislodging smaller rocks that clattered down the slope. Pat fired again, and this time the massive rock moved more noticeably. Dust rose as ancient earth was disturbed. The pursuing riders realized the danger too late. As the boulder broke free of its resting place, it triggered a cascade of smaller rocks. Within seconds, the minor slide became a thundering avalanche that swept down the mountainside, obliterating the trail and everything on it. Faith watched in horror as the wave of rock and debris engulfed the riders. Their screams were lost in the roar of the avalanche. Then her heart seized as she saw Pat, who had waited too long, scrambling desperately to escape the slide. He leapt onto his horse and spurred the animal down the trail, rocks pelting them from above as the avalanche gathered momentum. "Pat!" Faith cried, helpless to do anything but watch. Horse and rider raced down the trail just yards ahead of destruction. At the last moment, as the trail itself began to crumble beneath their hooves, Pat's horse gathered itself and leapt toward the wider section of path where Faith waited. They landed hard, the horse stumbling to its knees before regaining its footing behind them. The trail disappeared in a cloud of dust and falling rock. When the rumbling finally stopped and the dust began to settle, there was nothing left of the upper path or the men who had been on it. Pat sat on his trembling horse, breathing hard, dust and blood streaking his face. "I think," he said with remarkable calm, "we won't be followed anymore." Faith stared at him in disbelief, then began to laugh, a sound born of relief and lingering fear. "You created an avalanche. Again." "Seemed to work the first time," he said with a slight smile. Then, more seriously, "we should keep moving. There were 5 men chasing you initially. We only saw 3 back there." They continued down the mountain in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Faith felt numb, trying to process the death she had just witnessed. Even though those men had meant her harm, seeing them vanish beneath tons of rock was sobering. When they finally reached level ground at the bottom of the valley, Pat swayed in his saddle, his face pale beneath the coating of dust. "You're hurt worse than you said," Faith accused, dismounting quickly to help him down from his horse. "It's nothing," he insisted, but his legs buckled as his feet touched the ground. Faith caught him, struggling under his weight. "Let me see." Reluctantly, Pat allowed her to examine his arm. The bullet had cut a deep furrow across his upper arm, and he had lost a significant amount of blood. Faith tore strips from her petticoat to bind the wound. "We need to find shelter," she said as she worked. "You're in no condition to keep riding." Pat nodded toward the western end of the valley. "There's an old line shack about 3 miles that way, used by cowboys during roundup." They rode double on Faith's horse, leading Pat's mount, to conserve his strength. The line shack proved to be little more than a 1-room cabin with a small corral, but to Faith it looked like a palace. She helped Pat inside and settled him on a narrow bunk while she tended to the horses. By the time she returned, Pat had built a small fire in the stone fireplace, though the effort had clearly taxed his remaining strength. Faith heated water and properly cleaned and dressed his wound, using supplies from the medical kit she had brought from her wagon. "You should rest," she told him when she had finished. "We're safe here for now." Pat caught her hand as she turned away. "Faith," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I need to tell you something." She sat beside him on the edge of the bunk. "What is it?" "Those men back there, they weren't just after gold. They were after you specifically." Faith frowned. "What do you mean?" "In town, I overheard them talking. The leader Blackwell, he mentioned your name, said you were the key to controlling the claim legally." Pat's blue eyes were troubled. "I think he may have been your father's partner, the one who sent the telegram." Faith absorbed this news, her mind racing. The telegram was signed Blackwell, but why would he chase me if he was already partners with my father? Maybe the partnership went bad. Or maybe your father found out he was being cheated. Pat winced as he shifted position. Whatever the reason, he wanted you dead or captured. The gold was only part of it. The revelation chilled Faith. She thought of the words her father had written on the map. "Trust only those who have earned it." If Blackwell was in town, he wasn't among the men on the trail, she said slowly. "He could still be looking for us." "Yes," Pat agreed, "which is why we need to be careful. Even with the gold we have, you won't be safe until the legal ownership of the claim is settled." Faith thought of the saddlebags full of gold dust and nuggets. Enough to start a new life, but not if she had to keep running from Blackwell and whatever men he might hire next. "We should rest here tonight," she decided. "Tomorrow, we'll head for Leavenworth and find Wilkins. He can help us make sure the claim is legally mine." Pat nodded, his eyelids growing heavy as exhaustion and blood loss took their toll. Faith covered him with a blanket she found in the cabin and sat watching him sleep, her mind turning over everything that had happened since she'd left St. Louis. She had come west seeking security, hoping her father's mysterious gold claim might provide the means to live independently. Instead, she had found danger, violence, and death. But she had also found Owen Patterson, a man unlike any she had known, who had risked his life repeatedly for a woman he barely knew. As night fell, Faith kept watch, rifle across her knees like she had seen Pat do. Outside, an owl called and the horses shifted restlessly in the small corral. Despite the danger that might still be pursuing them, Faith felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever happened next, she was no longer alone. Morning brought a pale sun filtering through the cabin's single window. Faith, who had dozed in a chair, woke to find Pat already up, looking better than he had the previous evening. "You should have woken me for my turn at watch," he said, handing her a cup of coffee. "You needed the rest more than I did." She accepted the cup gratefully. "How's your arm?" "Sore, but I'll manage." He sat across from her at the small table. "I've been thinking about our next move. Leavenworth is still 2 days' ride from here, and Blackwell will be watching the roads. What do you suggest? There's a settlement called Miners' Rest about 10 miles east of here. Small place, but they have a telegraph office. We could send a message to Wilkins, arrange to meet somewhere less obvious than Leavenworth." Faith nodded, seeing the wisdom in his plan. "And then what?" Pat hesitated. "That depends on you, Miss Carter. Once the claim is legally secured, you'll have choices to make." He looked down at his coffee. "You could sell the claim outright or hire men to work it for you. Either way, you'd be a wealthy woman." Faith studied him, hearing what he wasn't saying. "And what about you? Would you go back to the bar, Em?" A shadow crossed his face. "I expect I will. It's good work, and the foreman depends on me." They rode out an hour later, heading east through the valley toward Miners' Rest. The day was clear and warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine from the surrounding hills. Under different circumstances, it would have been a pleasant journey. "Tell me about the bar, Em," Faith said as they rode. "What's it like working there?" Pat seemed surprised by her interest. "It's a good spread. 20,000 acres, running mostly Herefords these days. The owner, McAllister, is fair, pays on time, and doesn't ask his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself." "You enjoy it? The cowboy life?" He considered the question. "Most days. It's hard work and lonely sometimes, but there's something about watching the sun rise over open country that makes up for a lot." He glanced at her curiously. "Why do you ask?" Faith shrugged. "I'm trying to understand the life out here. In St. Louis, everything was prescribed. Here, it seems people make their own way." "They do," Pat agreed. "Though it's not always easy, especially for a woman alone." Faith thought of the gold in their saddlebags. "I won't be poor, at least. That counts for something." "It does," Pat said, "but money brings its own problems. Once word gets out about your claim, you'll have men circling like wolves, some looking to work for you, others looking to court you, and some just looking to take what you have. Like Blackwell." "Yes, though I think we've seen the last of his hired guns, at least for now." They reached Miners' Rest by mid-afternoon. The settlement was little more than a wide spot in the road, a general store that doubled as a post office, a small livery, a saloon, and a handful of rough cabins scattered along a dirt street. Pat suggested Faith wait at the livery while he sent the telegraph, reasoning that a woman traveling alone would attract more attention. She agreed, though she kept her hand near the small pistol in her pocket as she watched him walk toward the general store. While she waited, Faith noticed a rider coming into town from the west, a well-dressed man on a fine bay horse. Something about his confident posture and the way he surveyed the street set alarm bells ringing. When he dismounted in front of the saloon, she got a clear look at his face, handsome in a hard way, with a neatly trimmed black beard and cold eyes. Instinctively, Faith drew back into the shadows of the livery. This man matched the description of Blackwell that Pat had given her. Heart pounding, she watched as he entered the saloon, wondering if his presence was coincidence or if somehow he had tracked them to this obscure settlement. When Pat returned a few minutes later, she pulled him urgently into the shadows. "Blackwell is here," she whispered, pointing toward the saloon. Pat's expression hardened. "Are you sure? Black beard, expensive clothes, looks like he owns whatever room he's in." "Yes, I'm sure. We need to leave. Now." Pat quickly saddled their horses. "Did he see you?" "I don't think so." "Good. We'll head north, away from the road. There's a back trail that will eventually take us to Wilkins' sister's place in Topeka. He's agreed to meet us there." They led their horses quietly out the back of the livery, leaving payment with the confused stable boy. As they mounted up behind the building, Faith glanced toward the saloon and froze. Blackwell was standing on the porch, scanning the street. His gaze passed over the livery, then stopped and doubled back as he spotted movement. "He's seen us," Faith hissed. Pat looked over his shoulder and swore softly. Blackwell was already striding toward his horse, shouting for someone inside the saloon. "Ride," Pat ordered, spurring his horse. They galloped north, away from the settlement, pushing their mounts to a dangerous pace across the open grassland. Behind them, Faith could hear shouts and the thunder of pursuing hoofbeats. "They're coming after us," she called to Pat. He nodded grimly, not wasting breath on a reply. They rode hard for nearly an hour, gradually pulling ahead of their pursuers as the superior condition of their horses told over the distance. When they finally reached a stand of cottonwoods along a stream, Pat signaled for them to stop and water the blowing animals. "I count 3 riders," he said, watching their back trail. "Blackwell and 2 others. They're falling behind, but they're still coming." Faith fought to catch her breath. "How did he find us?" "Probably followed the same logic we did if we weren't heading straight for Leavenworth. Miner's Rest was the next likely stop." Pat's expression was grim. "We need to lose them before dark. If we can reach the hill country to the north, we might be able to shake them in the rougher terrain." As they prepared to mount up again, Faith noticed Pat wince as he raised his injured arm. "Your wound is bleeding again," she said, seeing fresh blood staining his bandage. "Can't be helped," he replied. "We need to keep moving." The chase continued throughout the afternoon, with Blackwell and his men doggedly following despite falling further behind. By early evening, Faith and Pat had reached the first line of hills, where the grassland gave way to rocky slopes and scattered pine. "If we can reach that ridge," Pat said, pointing to a line of cliffs ahead, "there's a trail that cuts through a narrow pass. Too tight for more than 1 horse at a time. I can hold them off while you get through." Faith shook her head. "I'm not leaving you to face them alone." "Faith," he began. "No, we stay together." Her tone brooked no argument. "There must be another way." Pat studied her determined face, then nodded slowly. "All right. Then we'll have to try something else." As twilight settled over the hills, they rode toward the ridge Pat had indicated. The cliff face was steep, with the trail zigzagging up to a narrow gap between 2 rock formations. When they reached the bottom of the path, Pat dismounted and began gathering dead branches and dry grass. "What are you doing?" Faith asked. "Making a welcome for our friends," he replied grimly. "This grass will burn fast and hot. If we time it right, we can cut them off from following us through the pass." Together, they arranged the combustible material along both sides of the trail. When they were satisfied, they mounted and rode up to the pass, stopping just on the other side of the narrow gap where the trail continued along a ledge overlooking a steep drop. "Now we wait," Pat said, checking his rifle. They didn't wait long. As darkness fell, they heard the approach of riders. Pat positioned himself at the edge of the pass, rifle ready. Faith stood beside him with her father's revolver, determined to defend herself if it came to that. The first rider came into view at the bottom of the trail, Blackwell himself, pushing his tired horse harder than was wise on the steep path. Two more riders followed, spread out along the switchbacks. "Wait until they are all on the trail," Pat whispered. When Blackwell was halfway up, and his companions were just starting the ascent, Pat struck a match and touched it to the dry grass. The fire caught immediately, racing along both sides of the trail in a line of hungry flame. Blackwell saw the danger and spurred his horse, trying to reach the pass before the fire blocked his way. His companions shouted in alarm as their horses reared and bucked, frightened by the rapidly spreading flames. "Now," Pat said, stepping into view with his rifle raised. "That's far enough, Blackwell." The man pulled his horse to a stop, flames now blocking his retreat. His hand hovered near his pistol. "Patterson," he said, recognizing Pat. "I should have known you'd be involved in this." "You know him?" Faith asked Pat, surprised. Pat's expression was hard. "We've never met, but I know his reputation. Jacob Blackwell has been cheating miners and jumping claims across 3 territories for years." Blackwell smiled coldly. "And you've been a thorn in my side more than once, Patterson, always playing the hero." His gaze shifted to Faith. "Miss Carter, your father was a shrewd businessman, but he should have been more careful about his partners." "You were stealing from him," Faith said, understanding dawning. "That's why he kept the claim secret. We had an agreement. I found the claim, he provided the capital. But then he got greedy, tried to edge me out." Blackwell's smile disappeared. "I was simply taking what was rightfully mine." "By having his daughter killed," Pat's finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle. Blackwell shrugged. "Business is business, nothing personal." His eyes narrowed. "But it seems I underestimated you both. So let's make a deal. The claim is worth more than either of you know. Let me partner with you, Miss Carter. With my connections, we could be very wealthy indeed." Faith felt only contempt for the man. "I'd rather throw the gold away than partner with my father's murderer." Blackwell's face darkened. "You stupid girl. You think you can run a mining operation. You'll be swindled within a month without someone like me to protect you." His hand moved toward his gun. "I gave you a chance to be reasonable." "Don't," Pat warned, his rifle steady. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Blackwell made his decision, drawing his pistol in one smooth motion. Pat fired first, his bullet striking Blackwell in the shoulder and spinning him halfway around. The man's shot went wild, and he nearly fell from his horse. Before he could recover, Faith stepped forward and fired her own weapon. Her shot caught Blackwell in the chest. He looked at her with surprise, then toppled from his saddle, falling to the trail just yards from where the flames now burned fiercely. Blackwell's 2 companions, seeing their leader fall and blocked by the spreading fire, wheeled their horses and fled back down the trail. Faith stood frozen, the smoking gun still in her hand. She had never fired at a person before, never taken a life. The reality of what she had done hit her like a physical blow. Pat gently took the pistol from her trembling fingers. "It's over," he said softly. "He can't hurt anyone else now." Faith looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "I killed him." "You defended yourself," Pat corrected firmly. "He would have killed us both without hesitation." He put an arm around her shoulders. "Come on, we should keep moving. Those other 2 might come back with reinforcements." They rode through the night, following the ridge trail by moonlight. Faith was largely silent, still processing the events at the pass. Pat respected her need for quiet, leading the way and stopping only when necessary to rest the horses. By dawn, they had put many miles between themselves and the scene of Blackwell's death. As the sun rose, they found themselves looking down on a small valley with a creek running through it and a modest farmhouse nestled among cottonwood trees. "That's the Harmon place," Pat said. "Sarah Harmon is Wilkins' sister. If he got my telegram, he should be waiting for us there." They approached cautiously, but their fears proved unfounded. Frank Wilkins was indeed waiting, along with his sister's family, who welcomed them warmly despite the early hour. After introducing Faith as his cousin, Wilkins led them to the kitchen where they could speak privately. "I've prepared the inheritance papers," he told Faith, producing documents from his coat. "Once these are filed, the claim will be legally yours with no question of ownership." "What about Blackwell's men?" Pat asked. Wilkins looked grim. "I've telegraphed the territorial marshal. Blackwell was wanted in Colorado for claim jumping and murder. His associates will be looking at prison if they're caught." Faith signed the papers with a steady hand, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Is it really over?" she asked. "The legal part is," Wilkins assured her. "The claim is yours to work or sell as you choose." After Wilkins left to file the papers, Faith and Pat were shown to separate rooms where they could rest. Faith slept deeply for the first time in days, free from the immediate fear of pursuit. When she awoke in the late afternoon, she found Pat sitting on the farmhouse porch, his injured arm now properly bandaged by Sarah Harmon, who had some medical training. "How are you feeling?" he asked as Faith joined him. "Better," she admitted. "Though I keep thinking about everything that's happened." Pat nodded, understanding. "It's a lot to process. Taking a life changes a person." "Yes," Faith agreed quietly. She looked out over the peaceful valley. "I've been thinking about what to do next, about the claim. And I'm going to sell it. Not all at once, but gradually to avoid flooding the local market with gold." She glanced at him. "Frank says he knows some reputable mining engineers who might be interested." Pat nodded. "Sounds sensible. And then I think I might buy some land. Not in Leavenworth, but somewhere nearby." She took a deep breath. "I was wondering what you would think about that." Pat looked at her, surprise evident in his blue eyes. "My opinion matters to you more than you know," Faith said softly. "These past days, I've come to value your judgment. And your company." A slow smile spread across Pat's face. "Well, I think land is always a good investment, Miss Carter, especially good grazing land if you were thinking of running some cattle." Faith felt her heart beating faster. "I was thinking exactly that. Though I'd need someone who knows the business to help me get started." "I might know someone," Pat said, his eyes never leaving hers. "A fellow who's been working for wages too long, when what he really wants is a place of his own. Would this fellow be interested in a partnership?" Faith asked, barely breathing. Pat reached out and took her hand. "I think he might be interested in more than that if you were offering." Faith smiled, squeezing his hand. "I am." 2 years later, Faith stood on the porch of a handsome 2-story ranch house, watching as Owen Patterson led a string of horses into the corral. The brand on their flanks, a stylized PC connected by a lightning bolt, marked them as property of the Patterson-Carter Ranch, now one of the most promising spreads in Kansas. The gold from her father's claim had provided the capital to build something neither of them could have achieved alone: a home, a business, and a future. Faith had sold the claim to a consortium of investors for a sum that had allowed them to purchase 5,000 acres of prime grazing land and stock it with quality cattle and horses. As Pat finished with the horses and walked toward the house, Faith felt the familiar warmth that his presence always brought her. Their courtship had been brief by Eastern standards, just 3 months before they were married in a small ceremony in Leavenworth, with Frank and Olivia Wilkins as witnesses. But Faith had never doubted her decision. "You're looking mighty pleased with yourself, Mrs. Patterson," Pat said as he climbed the steps to join her. "Something I should know about." Faith smiled and took his hand, placing it gently on her stomach. "I was just thinking that we might need to add a room to the house before winter." Pat's eyes widened as he understood her meaning. "Are you sure? The doctor confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. We're going to have a baby, Pat." His face lit up with joy, and he lifted her off her feet in a gentle embrace. "Faith Patterson, you've made me the happiest man in Kansas." As he set her down, Faith looked out over their land, the rolling pastures where Hereford cattle grazed, the creek lined with cottonwoods, the distant hills where they had once fled for their lives. So much had changed in 2 years. "You ever think about that day?" she asked. "When you created that avalanche to save me from Blackwell's men?" Pat followed her gaze to the hills. "Sometimes, though I prefer to think about what came after." Faith leaned against his shoulder. "I came west looking for security, but I found so much more." "As did I," Pat agreed, his arm tightening around her waist. "Though I still maintain that causing avalanches is not a sustainable way to court a woman." Faith laughed, the sound carrying across the peaceful ranch yard. "It worked for you, didn't it?" "That it did," he admitted with a smile. "That it did." As the sun set over their land, casting long shadows across the prairie they now called home, Faith Carter Patterson felt a contentment she had never thought possible in those desperate days fleeing across Kansas. She had found not just security but love, partnership, and the promise of family, a future built from danger and sacrifice, as solid and enduring as the land itself. And as Owen Patterson stood beside her, his hand still resting gently where their child grew, Faith knew that sometimes the most unexpected journeys led to the most perfect destinations. From a desperate flight across the plains to a home filled with love, it was more than she had ever dared to dream, and everything she had ever wanted.